Ronnie West had never been one to make noise. After spending the better part of 4 decades managing logistical operations for a freight company that ran coast to coast, he'd finally decided he'd earned his peace. He wasn't interested in lakeside cabins, gated golf communities, or beachfront properties lined with tourists. He wanted land, real, solid land that didn't carry a price tag built on hype. The parcel he found sat just outside a growing town that didn't know if it wanted to be rural or suburban. The plot was long and narrow, mostly trees and brush, but it had one thing Ronnie was looking for: a creek that twisted lazily through a small ravine near the southern edge, cool and clean, untouched by development. It wasn't much, but to him it was everything. He bought it outright with savings and his pension. No mortgage, no banks, no handouts. The land came with no utilities and a shack of a cabin that hadn't seen paint since the early 80s. But Ronnie didn't care. He fixed it up in stages: new roof, insulation, a proper deck with a grill station, and enough modern solar to keep his coffee pot humming and the lights on through the evening. He was a man who knew how to plan and execute. The land wasn't just a retirement fantasy, it was an asset. Ronnie cleared a small section near the creek for tent setups and added 3 rentable pads for folks with camper vans. He registered as a private recreational retreat under state land use law. Nothing fancy, just peace and quiet. His guests were fly fishers, small families, the occasional solo traveler who wanted to get out of the grid. He charged fair, kept the place clean, and made sure nobody bothered anyone. That was the deal. Respect the land, respect the peace. It was a mild spring morning when he first noticed something off. He was returning from town with a load of fencing lumber when he saw a flatbed truck heading down the southern access road, the back entrance of his property, which he rarely used. Ronnie had carved that road out himself over 2 summers, mostly to haul fallen trees and supplies in and out. It was barely a road at all, just enough gravel and clearance to let his old pickup through without bottoming out. The truck didn't look lost. It was followed by a second one, both loaded with thick metal beams and stacks of concrete panels. They weren't turning around. Ronnie pulled off to the side and waited. He watched them crawl past without slowing down, dust rising behind them. He didn't recognize the logo on the side, just some bland construction company name and a phone number he mentally noted. Ronnie turned the truck around and followed them slowly. When he reached the clearing near the ravine, his stomach dropped. The beams had already been unloaded. 6 men in vests and hard hats were moving with speed and certainty, unloading sections of pre-formed bridge supports. Someone had strung a bright orange barrier across the site, but there were no signs, no warnings, no one even checking to see who entered. Ronnie parked and stepped out, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate weight. One of the workers, a lanky guy barely past 20, looked up and offered a distracted wave. "Morning, sir," he said as if Ronnie were another contractor. Ronnie didn't answer. He scanned the site. They were staging the foundation directly over his creek. Steel pylons were lined up next to a temporary generator. Rebar cages stacked to one side suggested this wasn't some quick install. "Who's in charge here?" Ronnie asked finally, voice steady but with an edge that cut. The young man pointed toward a woman standing near a silver SUV, clipboard in hand, talking on a headset. She was round, flushed from the sun, wearing a neon vest 3 sizes too small. Her name tag read K. Maldrake. Karen, of course. Ronnie approached. She noticed him a beat too late, turning with the sort of smile people give when they assume they're about to get a compliment. "Good morning," she chirped. "If you're here about the traffic detour, don't worry, everything's moving ahead of schedule." Ronnie didn't blink. "This is private land. This creek, this clearing, it's mine. What the hell are you doing out here?" Karen's smile twitched, then returned with a tinge of condescension. "Oh, I understand the confusion. We're only doing what's necessary for community safety. This is a community project. Very temporary. You'll barely notice it once it's up." "I noticed it just fine," Ronnie replied. "I didn't approve any of this. You don't have right of way here. Who gave you access? Karen's smile faded. She clicked her headset off and lowered her voice, tone sharpening slightly. Sir, the bridge is being installed as part of a public access initiative connecting the new development south of here to the highway. It's only cutting through this edge of your property. We were told the land had an old utility easement. There's no easement, Ronnie snapped. I own this land. I've owned it for 6 years. It was cleared and resurveyed. Nobody crosses without my say-so. Karen's face flushed deeper. I think we need to revisit the documents. Perhaps there's been a clerical error, but the trucks are scheduled. The equipment is already en route. Delaying now would be unproductive. Ronnie exhaled slowly. She was bluffing, or worse, she'd been told to act like she had authority. That meant someone up the line had greenlit this without checking ownership. Or worse, they assumed he'd fold quietly. Pack it up, he said coldly. You don't have permission. You don't have the right. Get your people off my land before I call the sheriff. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. We'll make a call, she said, tone icy now. Someone will be in touch. Ronnie turned without another word and walked back to his truck. He didn't slam the door, didn't speed away. He simply drove up to his cabin, pulled out the deed, the parcel maps, the permit for his recreational retreat, and laid them on the table. He made a pot of coffee, poured himself a cup, and stared out the window at the tree line. He'd worked too long and too damn hard to have someone sneak a road through his land like it was nothing. And if they thought this was going to be simple, just another stubborn landowner to ignore, they were in for a surprise. Ronnie West wasn't the kind of man who fought loud, but when he fought, he didn't stop until he had answers, and he didn't play fair. The bridge wasn't going to be temporary. He could feel it. Someone had plans, and they hadn't expected him to be the kind of man who'd tear those plans apart, bolt by bolt if he had to. But first, he'd need to find out just how deep this went, and just how far he'd have to go to stop it. The next morning brought no sense of calm. The dew still clung to the grass and the air had the fresh bite of early spring, but Ronnie West wasn't in the mood to enjoy it. His usual routine, coffee on the deck, checking the perimeter, prepping for any incoming campers, was replaced by the unmistakable low drone of heavy machinery firing up in the distance. Not more than a quarter mile from his cabin, just past the tree line, engines were already humming, metal clinking, and voices shouting through the rising fog. He didn't rush. He dressed methodically, boots laced tight, vest zipped, hat on, clipboard in hand. Not because he was trying to play sheriff, but because he knew that if he showed up looking like just another cranky old man with a chip on his shoulder, no one would listen. The only way to fight bureaucratic arrogance was with methodical clarity, and Ronnie had made a career out of not blinking first. He walked the path down toward the ravine. No one had called, no one had emailed, no letter, no posted notice. He was being tested. He knew that now. Not through violence or threats, but with quiet, procedural aggression. The kind that made you look like the problem just for defending what you already owned. As he approached the site, it was clear they'd made serious headway overnight. Temporary pillars had been driven into the banks of the creek, and a steel platform was already suspended across the span. They worked with eerie precision, like they'd done this 100 times. That wasn't what unsettled him, though. It was the yellow sign someone had planted on a post just off the gravel. Community Transit Initiative, Future Pathway, supported by Regional Development Committee and neighborhood partners. Ronnie stood in front of the sign for a full minute, jaw tight, trying to understand how anyone thought this was acceptable. His land wasn't public. It wasn't under negotiation. He wasn't behind on taxes or facing zoning issues. And yet, here it was. His ravine now serving as someone else's shortcut. He stepped forward until he caught the eye of a man standing near a cluster of orange cones, clipboard in hand. The man was older than the other workers, built like a man who hadn't sat still in years, and he watched Ronnie approach with visible caution. "You the site manager?" Ronnie asked, his voice calm but firm, as if he were addressing someone who'd parked a car in his driveway without asking. I'm with the contractor, the man replied. Southland Earthworks. We were contracted through a public-private partnership agreement. Look, I get it. This kind of thing gets people upset. But if you've got questions, you'll need to take it up with the liaison. She'll be here shortly. Ronnie's eyes narrowed. Karen. The man gave a hesitant nod. Yeah, that's her name. Of course it was. Ronnie exhaled through his nose and stepped back, looking over the site again. The foundation on the north side of the bridge extended beyond where the creek met his property line. It wasn't even a technical overlap anymore. They were well within his land. Driving bolts into ground he'd cleared, surveyed, maintained, and protected. This wasn't a dispute about inches. This was a takeover. Ronnie didn't wait. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, his boots dragging mud as he moved. By the time he got home, he already knew his next step. He pulled out his folder of land documents, certified survey, ownership deed, tax clearance, environmental inspection reports. Everything was clean, everything current. He sat at his table and drafted 2 letters, one to the county registrar, demanding clarification on whether any easements had been filed without his knowledge. The second went to the Regional Planning Commission, formally inquiring about any infrastructure projects planned across private property within the past 6 months. He scanned his documents, attached copies to both emails, and sent them off with digital timestamps. Then he called the number listed on the construction vehicle he'd seen the day before. The company rep sounded caught off guard when he answered. Ronnie explained the situation with sharp clarity. His land, his title, no access granted, and asked for a name. The rep fumbled for an answer, repeating the phrase, "per our agreement," several times without being able to identify which agency had filed the original project authorization. Ronnie didn't yell. He just took notes, thanked the man for his transparency, and ended the call. Later that afternoon, while reviewing footage from his trail cams near the southern edge, Ronnie noticed something even more troubling. Several unfamiliar SUVs had pulled up the night before, headlights off, unloading crates near the bridge site. No license plates were visible, and no company logos. The footage didn't show much but enough to raise questions. If this was a public project, why was it operating with such quiet urgency? In the dark, on a piece of land they hadn't bothered to confirm legal access to. Ronnie forwarded the footage to his lawyer, Tom Durham, a level-headed, slow-speaking man who had helped him close on the land years ago and knew how things worked behind the curtain. Tom called back the next morning, his tone unusually clipped. "I don't like this," Tom said. "They're acting like they've already won. That only happens when someone higher up gave them cover. We're not talking about a miscommunication. This is either full-on negligence or someone assumed you'd be too small to fight." Ronnie stared out the window. The machinery at the creek could still be heard in the distance, humming like a drill through his skull. What do I do next? "I'll start with a cease and desist," Tom said, "and I'll file a demand for proof of easement claim. If they can't produce it, the project has to pause. But I'll be honest, Ron. This won't get solved through letters alone. If they've got county backing, they'll stall, deny, or just flat-out lie. You'll need to be 2 steps ahead." "Already working on it," Ronnie replied. That afternoon, he called in a professional land assessor he'd used once before during a dispute with a neighboring property. The man confirmed after a 2-hour inspection that the bridge not only crossed into Ronnie's land but extended 37 feet past the property line, into a segment zoned for environmental conservation. That was big. Any intrusion into that section could trigger state-level reviews, and serious delays for the developers behind it. Ronnie didn't sleep much that night, not from fear, but calculation. He didn't want to make it a crusade. He didn't want to be the man yelling on the news or waving signs. He wanted to win the only way that mattered by forcing the people behind the bridge to admit they screwed up. Not for the sake of justice, but for leverage. He rose before dawn, walked the land quietly, noted every track in the mud, every new scratch on the trees where machinery had scraped past, And when the sun broke over the hills and lit up the half-built monstrosity they'd planted across his creek, he stood still, took a slow breath, and knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going away on its own, and neither was he. The following week marked a turning point. Whatever silence or vague professionalism that had previously coated the entire situation peeled away like cheap paint. It started subtly. A broken chain across the southern access trail that Ronnie had strung up to mark the property line, then a plastic bag filled with used construction debris tossed under his private property, no trespassing sign, and then, just 2 days later, a utility flag appeared out of nowhere about 10 yards from the creek bed, staked directly into his soil without warning or explanation. Ronnie didn't bother asking who put it there. He already knew the answer. What disturbed him wasn't just the brazenness. It was the smug certainty with which it was done, as if the people behind the project no longer felt the need to pretend they were negotiating. They were taking. Quietly, efficiently, and under the cover of a bureaucratic camouflage, they were laying siege to his land one orange stake at a time. Ronnie called Tom again. The lawyer's voice was clipped, tight with tension, and it didn't take much prompting to hear just how deep this had gotten. The cease and desist letter had been acknowledged, but not by the construction company. Instead, it was forwarded to a non-governmental regional development group that had apparently been assisting in infrastructure expansion under the guise of connectivity planning. Tom, ever methodical, had already started digging into them. What he found wasn't technically illegal, but it stank of opportunism and pay-to-play politics. This group had been partnering with homeowners' boards, real estate developers, and even church councils to force through small-scale public works projects on semi-rural land, always under some lofty name like Unified Access Corridor or Sustainable Mobility Partnership. None of it would hold up in court if the landowners pushed back hard enough, but the strategy was simple. Most wouldn't. Most didn't have the stomach, the time, or the resources to wage a drawn-out legal battle while backhoes chewed through their backyards. Ronnie was not most. That afternoon, he called his old contact from the Department of Natural Resources, Marcus Holloway, a no-nonsense field officer who had helped Ronnie back when a previous neighbor tried to dam a portion of the creek upstream. Marcus didn't sugarcoat things. He said he'd be out by the end of the week, but warned that the burden of proof was already stacked against him. "You're not fighting the land laws, Ron," he said. "You're fighting a narrative. They're already calling it community improvement. You're the guy blocking a better route to the highway. You gotta be smart, clean, precise." Ronnie took that advice to heart. He hired a drone pilot from town and documented every square foot of intrusion. He made a grid, labeled timestamps, marked vehicles, and logged soil disturbance. He cross-referenced footage from his own security cameras. He printed everything out, labeled it by hand, compiled it into a folder thicker than his grandfather's old Bible, and delivered a copy straight to Tom. Not for drama, for court. On the third Tuesday of April, Ronnie found a folded letter tucked under his cabin side door. No envelope, just a dense trifold printed in thin serif font. It bore no official seal, just the heading, Project Participation Agreement, Advanced Notification of Implementation Phase. The language was nauseatingly vague. Talk of integration, community good, shared utility, low-impact installation, and buried. Halfway down was a veiled threat. "We appreciate your patience during this period of regional enhancement. Property owners impeding scheduled integration activities may be subject to civil remedy per applicable administrative code." Ronnie didn't tear it up. He made 6 copies. 3 for legal, 2 for the State Land Bureau, and 1 to hand-deliver back to the construction site. When he arrived that afternoon, the work had escalated. A crew of no less than 12 were now on site. Heavy equipment was parked well into his boundary line, and a concrete mixer was actively prepping material. He walked straight through the site without a word, ignoring the shouts, ignoring the flapping vests, and placed the letter, now annotated in red ink, directly on a folding table near the supply crates. A younger man tried to stop him, clearly rattled by his presence, but Ronnie didn't even glance at him. He turned and left. That night, the power at the cabin cut out for 7 hours. Ronnie's system was solar with battery backups and a failsafe generator. That kind of outage didn't happen. The diagnostic later showed intentional overdraw on the shared pole line running down the county road. Someone had accessed the line junction and pulled enough surge to trip his backups. It wasn't an accident, it was a message. Ronnie didn't respond with panic. He responded with paperwork. The next morning, he filed a formal complaint with the Public Utilities Commission and added the incident to his building case. He filed for temporary injunctive relief. He requested a soil contamination check near the bridge installation site and requested an emergency assessment of the creek's ecological health, citing runoff and erosion. Each filing slowed them down. Each filing forced them to produce something: permits, plans, engineering specs, usage rights, and with each response, Ronnie's side learned more about how little the builders actually had in place. Karen reappeared a few days later. She wasn't smiling this time. She didn't walk up to the cabin. She stood across the access road in a clean beige coat and oversized sunglasses and spoke just loud enough for Ronnie to hear. "You're making this very difficult for everyone, Mr. West." He stood in his driveway, arms crossed, face impassive. "Everyone who, Karen? You and your concrete friends?" "You're fighting something bigger than you think," she said, voice colder than before. "I'm just the face. This isn't going to stop because you filed some letters." Ronnie smiled, just slightly. "Then maybe it's time they get a new face." She didn't respond. She left the way she came, tires spitting dust. That evening, a dead fox was left on his driveway. No blood, no wounds, just placed, laid out like an offering or a threat. Ronnie didn't call the sheriff. He didn't clean it himself. He called the Department of Wildlife and let their investigator document everything. Within hours, the carcass was gone, bagged, tagged, and filed. Another paper trail, another point for the record. By the end of the week, Marcus Holloway from the DNR arrived, took samples from the creek, and confirmed what Ronnie suspected. The runoff from the construction site had already altered the silt patterns and likely contaminated the downstream pocket where fish nested in warmer months. That was a violation. That was ammunition. Real, actionable, and fully within state jurisdiction. Tom filed for a full environmental injunction. It wouldn't stop the project forever, but it would force a pause. A hearing was scheduled. Ronnie spent the night before the court date walking the edge of the creek with a flashlight. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired. He felt ready. But most of all, he felt resolved. The kind of quiet resolve that doesn't need speeches or applause. Just the sound of boots on earth, the smell of water and moss. The weight of knowing that if you don't defend your ground, no one else will. The bridge loomed in the shadows, unfinished, gleaming faintly in the moonlight like a wound that hadn't closed. Ronnie stared at it for a long time, and then he turned, walked back to his cabin, and waited for the dawn. The courtroom was dry and colorless, a long rectangular box with dim lighting and beige walls that looked like they hadn't seen paint since the 90s. Ronnie sat at the petitioner's table, flanked by Tom and an environmental consultant from the DNR named Sylvie Krause, a woman in her 40s who carried herself like someone used to being ignored until she started talking. The judge was a lean man with thin glasses and a quiet voice that forced everyone to listen carefully. Across from them sat 3 representatives from the development partnership. One from the contractor, one from the so-called Regional Connectivity Task Force, and Karen herself, now dressed in a navy pantsuit and fiddling with a legal pad she never actually wrote on. She never looked directly at Ronnie. That alone said more than any statement she'd prepared. The hearing was technical by nature, meant to establish whether there was a credible harm to the land under current construction and whether the project posed an ongoing threat to environmental conditions. It wasn't about property rights, not yet. That fight would come later. For now, Ronnie needed a delay, a freeze, a reason to force these people to stop hammering metal into his soil long enough to drag them into the light. Sylvie delivered her analysis like a prosecutor, clear, evidence-based, and utterly indifferent to the niceties of the room. She outlined how the sediment tested downstream from the bridge site showed elevated levels of iron and disturbed organic matter that indicated erosion was occurring due to unauthorized groundwork. She referenced runoff paths, soil displacement charts, and aquatic displacement ratios that made the judge frown, then start taking notes. It was dry language but devastating in implication. Environmental law in this state didn't play around with freshwater disturbance, especially when the land hadn't been surveyed for that kind of stress. The defense tried to pivot. Their consultant stuttered through a brief statement about pre-approval communications and assumed allowances. But when asked to produce documentation of any formal right of entry agreement, he faltered. Karen tried to shift the discussion to community benefit, describing the bridge as a vital lifeline between developments that would otherwise face congestion and emergency access delay. Tom cut that apart calmly, noting that no public notice had ever been issued, no community forums had been held, and no emergency service zones had logged complaints of access issues. The judge listened without expression, then asked the final question that turned the room cold. Why was no permit filed with the Department of Natural Resources before creek construction began? There was no answer, just a flicker in Karen's posture as her hands folded a little too tightly over the notepad. A week later, the ruling came in the form of a temporary injunction. All work on the structure was to cease until a comprehensive environmental review could be conducted. The order didn't condemn the project outright, but it drew a legal line in the mud. No more progress, no more quiet advancement. And most importantly, it recognized that the land was being impacted without due process. Ronnie didn't smile when he read the order. He didn't pump his fist or call anyone. He just folded the paper, placed it in his file, and went back to walking his property, one boundary post at a time, marking down any new tire marks, any trash, any unauthorized footprints in the wet grass. The game had shifted, but the players were still on the board. 3 days after the injunction, an SUV returned to the creek path and parked just inside the fence. Ronnie saw it on camera before he heard it, and by the time he reached the site, the door was already open and Karen was standing there again, alone this time. No sunglasses, no clipboard, just that same artificial calm that cracked every time she didn't get her way. "I'm not here to argue," she said. "I just want to explain something before this gets worse." Ronnie leaned against the post, arms folded. He didn't speak. Karen exhaled and looked toward the bridge, still half-formed, half-sunken in mud. This wasn't supposed to be like this. The bridge was going to be good for everyone. Connect the estates, cut commute times, boost value. But no one wanted to talk to a man who owns 20 acres and camps out in a shack. "That shack's more legal than your entire project," Ronnie said without raising his voice. She winced, just barely, but recovered. "We were told you'd be cooperative, that you'd be reasonable. Instead, you've gone to court, to the press, to the state." "I haven't said a damn word to the press," Ronnie said. "And going to the state was your gift to me the moment your trucks crossed my line." Karen looked away, her jaw tight. "You're fighting something bigger than property. The people behind this, developers, funders, they don't care about creek laws or boundaries. They work with policy, pressure, and they wait you out. They always wait people out." Ronnie's gaze didn't soften. Then maybe they're overdue for a reminder of what happens when they push the wrong piece of land. Karen didn't answer that. She turned back toward the car. "They'll double down," she said over her shoulder. "You bought yourself time, but not protection. Just be careful who you trust from now on." She left without slamming the door. Ronnie watched the car retreat, gravel snapping under its wheels, then turned back to the creek. A soft wind moved through the trees. The bridge stood still, ugly, frozen, out of place like an iron bone sticking out of the earth. That night, he opened an email from the geotechnical firm he'd contracted 2 weeks prior, part of a long-term plan he'd set in motion after the second site inspection. The results were preliminary, but clear. The shallow geothermal mapping of his southern field, just 40 yards from the bridge, showed heat gradients inconsistent with standard sediment. There was something under the ground, possibly a geothermal pocket or a minor reservoir of thermally active water. Ronnie read it twice, then leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The bridge wasn't just a trespass now. It was leverage. It was barely past sunrise when the first sign appeared. White vinyl banners strung across county fencing at the edge of the new development, stretching like corporate declarations of intent. Connecting communities. Phase 2. Mobility for the future. The words were printed in large, cheerful letters, but the message was anything but friendly. Ronnie saw them on his way back from town after picking up new piping for the lower field. It was a crisp morning, and the haze hadn't yet burned off the trees, but even from the road he could see it. New survey markers had been placed along the perimeter of his southern line. Not only were they pressing in from the creek, they were expanding. And this time they weren't hiding behind construction trucks or vague contractors. This was administrative, strategic. It reeked of zoning shifts and policy loopholes, the kind of slow erosion of ownership that didn't happen with bulldozers but with paper and procedural exhaustion. By the time he reached his cabin, the email was already waiting. It was from a woman at the Regional Planning and Infrastructure Alignment Committee, some freshly minted department with a long name and no real identity, likely created just for this operation. The email was polished, detached, and deeply infuriating. It stated that his land had been identified as a candidate parcel for potential temporary access under a cooperative land integration clause recently approved at the county level. It didn't say he was being forced. It didn't use the word seized, but it danced around those terms with corporate grace. If he refused access, the email warned, it could result in a suspension of future permit applications and a formal review of his existing land use exemptions. Ronnie didn't respond. He printed the email, added it to the file, and made 2 calls. The first was to Tom, who confirmed that no such clause existed within the framework of Ronnie's land agreements. The second was to a local zoning officer named Harlan, an old acquaintance with a drinking problem and an impeccable memory for every backroom deal that had ever taken place in this county. Harlan met Ronnie 2 hours later at a diner outside of town. They sat in a booth where the blinds didn't quite close and the waitress called everyone "Hon." "You didn't hear this from me," Harlan muttered, sliding a paper napkin across the table with names scribbled in shaky handwriting. "But they've had your parcel on the map for months. The geothermal scan flagged it in the utility assessment, and someone from one of the boards leaked it. They're not after your creek anymore. They want what's under it." Ronnie stared at the napkin. 3 names. One of them was a member of the board that had originally denied road widening near the subdivision. Another was a city planner. The third, unsurprisingly, was Karen M. "What's their play?" "They reclassify you," Harlan said. "Rezone your property as a transitional corridor. They claim it serves multiple communities. That lets them push for eminent domain under cooperative regional usage. You won't lose everything, just the pieces they need, and they'll drag you through court until you bleed cash." Ronnie nodded once. He didn't argue. He didn't curse. He thanked Harlan, paid for the meal, and left. That night, he drove stakes around the geothermal zone, sectioned it off with hazard markers, and installed 2 wildlife motion cameras at opposing angles. The next morning, one was gone. The second had been spray-painted, lens blinded with a smear of dull gray. He filed a report with the sheriff's office. It wouldn't go anywhere, he knew that, but it added to the record. Every move now was about stacking evidence. And while they played policy games, Ronnie laid groundwork. He contacted a private energy consultant, someone out of state, unaffiliated with the local cliques, whose firm specialized in early-stage geothermal analysis. The man arrived in a rental car and wore plain clothes, just another camper to any watching eyes. Over the next 48 hours, they performed subsurface tests and captured thermal maps. The consultant didn't say much, but his eyes lit up when he looked at the readings. "You're sitting on a low-grade geothermal tap," he said. "Small scale, but stable. Perfect for microgrid usage or green recreation applications. It's not oil, but it's power. You've got something here." Ronnie nodded. "Put it in writing." He also began redesigning his property plans, shifting the emphasis from temporary camping to eco-energy retreat. He filed the changes with the county under legal categories that made it more difficult to classify his land as underutilized. He applied for grant consideration under 2 renewable energy initiatives. Within 10 days, his paperwork was under review by the state. On the surface, it looked like a man modernizing his property. In truth, it was a counteroffensive. He wasn't just defending anymore, he was turning their ambition against them. Karen returned, but not alone. This time she brought a man named Dwyer, middle-aged with a face like old leather and a contractor's gait. He introduced himself as a compliance supervisor and handed Ronnie a packet of papers, each marked with the seal of the Infrastructure Committee. They weren't threats, not technically, but they were stacked with language about conditional violations, community arbitration boards, and procedural reviews. Ronnie read them in silence, then asked a single question. "Did anyone here file this with the property office before stepping foot on my soil?" Dwyer didn't answer. Karen just shifted her weight. Ronnie handed the papers back. "Then we're done." That evening, the new fence along his geothermal field was cut in 3 places. Small, surgical incisions like someone testing the edges. Ronnie fixed it by morning and replaced the wiring with low-current alarm lines, enough to trip a sound, not harm anyone. When the alarm went off 2 nights later, he didn't confront them. He watched the grainy footage. 2 figures, one holding what looked like a mapping tablet, scanning the ground, the other shining a flashlight at the soil. They left in less than 5 minutes, but it was enough. Ronnie sent the footage to Tom. "That's no longer trespassing," Tom said. "That's unauthorized environmental surveying. I can file for an injunction." "Do it." At the same time, Ronnie sent a quiet message to the State Energy Office. Not a formal report. Just a heads up that an identified private geothermal parcel had been compromised by unauthorized entry. Within 72 hours, a formal audit was scheduled. Not for Ronnie, but for the Infrastructure Committee. The game had changed. The next blow came from the county. A sudden notification arrived. Ronnie's parcel would be subject to a land use hearing, ostensibly to determine whether his recent development filings conflicted with regional integration plans. It was a trap, a public setting where his property could be painted as an obstacle to progress. But Ronnie came prepared. With legal precedent, environmental impact statements, and a fresh letter of interest from a green tech investor who had reviewed his geothermal data. The hearing was long, tedious, and hostile. Karen made her case with polished precision, painting Ronnie's resistance as obstructionist, outdated, anti-growth. But when the county board reviewed the data and saw the state's active review of the geothermal tap, everything shifted. Now the land wasn't just private, it was potentially valuable to state renewable initiatives. The vote was split, 3-2. Ronnie won. His land designation remained intact. Outside, Karen didn't speak, but Dwyer did. He stopped Ronnie on the way to his truck. "You should have taken the early buyout," he muttered. "This was never about you." Ronnie stared at him, silent, steady, then got in the truck and drove away. Later that night, he stood at the edge of the unfinished bridge watching moonlight flicker on the steel. He lit a cigar, his first in 10 years, and smiled. They came for his land. Now they'd pay rent for standing on it. The storm didn't break with thunder, but with silence. In the weeks following the zoning board hearing, everything grew unnaturally quiet. No trucks moved on the gravel road, no workers appeared, no new flags or banners were staked into Ronnie's soil. It wasn't peace, it was a pause, the kind of stillness that comes before someone fires the last shot in a long and ugly war. Ronnie wasn't fooled by it. He knew the game hadn't ended. The silence meant lawyers were working overtime, that backdoor meetings were being held, that someone was preparing one last push to shift the field before they lost control of it entirely. The difference now was that he was no longer a target. They were. What triggered the escalation wasn't anything Ronnie did. It was what the state did. The Department of Energy's Land Resource Division released its preliminary map updates for the next renewable initiative phase. And smack in the middle of the proposed microgrid test sites sat a pin on Ronnie's property, labeled Active Private. Geothermal Candidate. That label changed everything. It wasn't just about creeks and bridges anymore. It wasn't even about road access. Now it was about a recognized energy zone, and with that recognition came oversight, regulation, protection. Anyone attempting to manipulate or interfere with that land would be doing so under the eye of federal watchdogs, environmental compliance officers, and investment auditors. The response was immediate. Karen and her development group didn't send another polite email. They filed a challenge, a formal motion to appeal the geothermal classification, claiming the testing data had been fabricated and the landowner had manipulated the readings to block a critical community project. They used Ronnie's own restraint against him, his history of independence, his refusal to engage with public dialogue, his quiet, persistent escalation. They painted him as an obstructionist grifter trying to inflate his property value by pretending it had strategic energy potential. On paper, it was an aggressive, calculated smear meant to fracture the credibility of the classification and stall the state's interest long enough for their road project to resume. But they had made one fatal mistake. They assumed Ronnie had been working alone. Tom filed a response within 24 hours, complete with affidavits from the independent energy consultant, time-stamped thermal scans, third-party soil data, and, most damning of all, a signed letter of interest from a renewable energy cooperative in northern Colorado willing to invest pending a final classification. It wasn't speculation, it was leverage, and the court saw it for what it was. The judge threw out the appeal before it even reached hearing. Worse for the developers, the incident triggered a review of their previous filings, specifically their environmental compliance logs. A routine audit turned into a full-scale inquiry when it was discovered that several of the documents filed in support of the bridge project had been generated internally by Karen's own subcommittee and submitted without third-party verification. It wasn't criminal fraud, but it was enough for the Office of Land Integrity to get involved. Ronnie didn't celebrate. He just kept walking his property every morning, boots on earth, clipboard in hand, eyes on the creek and the bridge and the place where the steel met the mud. That's where it finally happened. On a Tuesday just before noon, when two black SUVs pulled up to the edge of the unfinished structure and 3 federal investigators stepped out. They didn't ask permission. They didn't wave papers. They walked the site with cameras, ground sensors, and notebooks. They asked questions of no one and left without saying a word. But Ronnie knew what it meant. 3 days later, a formal stop order was issued on the bridge. Not from the state, but from the Office of Infrastructure Oversight. The unfinished structure was declared non-compliant and ordered dismantled pending the results of the broader investigation. The contractor was fined, the planning committee's budget was frozen, and Karen was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. It didn't go public, not yet. But word spread. Ronnie received no apology, no knock on the door, no handshake. What he got instead was an official letter, dry and clinical, confirming that the bridge was to be removed and any disruption to his land remediated by the county within 90 days. That would have been enough for most men. But Ronnie didn't stop there. He filed a lien against the development group for unauthorized access and demanded restitution for the soil damage, the fence replacement, and the cost of private security he'd been forced to install. When the lien passed review, the developers were forced into settlement. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to build out the geothermal site properly, to install a smart monitoring station, to register his property with the state's clean energy network as a private partner. Enough to turn the scar they'd carved across his land into a gateway of revenue and control. In early summer, a crew arrived, not from the county or any of the old contractors, but a private restoration team hired under the settlement agreement. They came with neutral logos, no loud branding, no PR spin. They worked fast and without complaint. In less than 2 weeks, the bridge was gone. The creek flowed clean again. The access road regraded and reseeded. The steel supports hauled away like junk from a bad dream. Ronnie watched them work from a distance, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet satisfaction born not from revenge, but from preservation. He hadn't beaten a corporation. He'd protected his line. He'd outlasted the grind. When the last truck left, he walked down to the bank, stood where the structure had cast its shadow for months, and ran his hand through the soil. The earth was soft again. The wound was healing. Later that night, he sat on his deck with a black coffee and a folded letter. The state's final approval for classification, bearing a seal that confirmed what he already knew. The land was his, not just in deed, but in function, in recognition, in permanence. No more hearings, no more threats. Just space, quiet, and the low, constant thrum of something alive deep beneath his feet, waiting to be used on his terms. The bridge was gone, but the future had already crossed it. By late summer, the land had changed, not in the way developers envisioned, but in the way only someone who truly owned something could bring about. Where concrete had once stained the creek's edge, native grasses now pushed through fresh soil. The old walking path was restored, lined with low solar markers that glowed faintly at night, not for decoration, but for direction. The geothermal monitoring station was modest, barely the size of a garden shed, but inside it was all fiber optics and quiet hums, controlled heat mapping, sediment logs, and flow data that updated hourly. Ronnie checked it every morning, more out of habit than necessity. The readings were steady, and the state was happy. More importantly, no one came anymore without knocking. Karen was gone. Not quietly, but with the kind of administrative vanishings that left no trace in the paper trail. Just a missing nameplate, a bounced email, a seat left empty at the Community Infrastructure Council. Dwyer resigned a week later. The development consortium that had tried to pressure Ronnie folded its local operations under a different name. There was no press release, no admission, just quiet closure, like a door someone didn't want slammed. Ronnie didn't take a victory lap. He didn't call reporters, didn't post updates, didn't stand on a soapbox. He poured his energy into the land. He expanded the retreat slowly, not as a business, but as an extension of the land's purpose. Eco-cabins with radiant heat pulled directly from the earth, weekend classes on sustainable living, private spaces for veterans and workers who needed solitude and couldn't find it anywhere else. He didn't advertise. He didn't have to. The right people always found it. One morning, a state representative stopped by, an older man with a calm voice and weathered hands, there to discuss a small cooperative grant for rural energy nodes. He asked Ronnie why he had resisted the project so hard when it might have made his land more connected. Ronnie didn't answer right away. He just looked toward the creek, the trees, the slope of his property as it caught the light. Then he said, "Because connection without consent is just trespassing with a smile." The man nodded. He understood. The land never forgot what it had endured. Even as it healed, small reminders remained. Scarred tree trunks, stakes pulled from the ground but still visible in dry months, that flat spot where the bridge had sat for too long. Ronnie left most of it untouched. Not out of bitterness, but as a kind of quiet reminder that ownership wasn't just paperwork or fences. It was presence, persistence, and the willingness to say no when everyone else says, "give up." By autumn, the site was fully certified. The geothermal designation secured long-term tax credits, and Ronnie's parcel was listed as a protected energy corridor. Developers couldn't touch it without state-level hearings and environmental surveys they'd never pass. The threat was gone, not because it had been defeated in one stroke, but because it had been worn down, exposed, and starved of access. Ronnie had made himself not just a landowner, but a barrier, and in doing so, he turned the very thing they'd tried to take from him into something they could never buy: control. One evening, as the wind picked up and the leaves danced along the gravel path, Ronnie sat on the deck and watched the sun fold into the hills. There was no applause, no headlines, no parade, just silence, the kind he'd fought for, the kind that was earned, and beneath his boots, deep in the earth, the warmth remained. Waiting. Steady. His.